Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. Jane Eyre. By Charlotte Brontë. Jane Eyre is a Gothic novel written by Charlotte Brontë in 1847 and first published under the masculine pseudonym Currer Bell. It was published by the London business Smith, Elder, and Company. The novel is set in the early decades of the 19th century and centers around the story of a young girl named Jane Eyre who is orphaned at an early age and brought to live with her aunt. Jane experiences severe cruel treatment at her aunt's home until she is sent out to school. Once she comes of age, Jane quickly decides to accept a post as a governess in a manor house. But soon after taking the role, Jane realizes that something dark and nasty is going on at the house and it will take all of her wits to unearth the truth. In the beginning of the story we're introduced to a young girl named Jane Eyre who is an orphan with no memory of her parents. Jane is sitting peacefully and reading in the home of her affluent aunt. Because of her aunt's cruelty, Jane is not permitted to play with her cousins, Eliza, Georgiana, and John. In the first scene of the novel, John is tormenting Jane for being an orphan, and when Jane fights back she is held fully accountable for the crimes of John and confined to the Red Chamber by her aunt. The Red Chamber is what Jane calls the terrible room where her uncle died. Once in the Crimson Chamber, Jane sees what she thinks is her uncle's ghost coming to exact revenge on Jane's aunt for not taking care of Jane as she told him she would. Jane faints out of terror. When Jane awakes she is being treated by Mr. Lloyd, a gentle guy who functions as the family's doctor. A boarding school for girls is something Mr. Lloyd suggests to Jane's aunt. Jane is giddy with anticipation. Jane witnesses a chat amongst some of the maids that reveals a little more about her personal history during this time. In her research, she learns that her parents died of typhus, and that her mother was a member of the wealthy Reed family before she married her poor father out of love. Jane is moved to the Lowood School soon after. It's not long until Jane meets Mr. Brocklehurst, a devoutly pious man who has an immediate and strong distaste for her. When Jane's aunt informs Mr. Brocklehurst that she is a habitual liar, he tells her that he wants to inform all of her instructors. Helen Burns, a pupil toward whom their teacher Miss Scatcherd appears to be particularly unkind, becomes Jane's friend once she is introduced to her new classmates and teachers. A charity school for orphan girls, Lowood has Mr. Brocklehurst as its principal, Jane discovers through Helen. Jane quickly learns that the conditions at the school are far from ideal. Girls at the facility are overworked and underfed, they are also forced to dwell in sub-zero conditions. Jane's connection with Helen provides some solace, but she soon learns that Mr. Brocklehurst will be returning to the school. His threat to inform her professors that he would expose her as a liar has left Jane fearing the worst. In her fear, she becomes clumsy and drops a slate on Mr. Brocklehurst's desk. While informing the other kids that she is a liar all day long, he loses his fury and forces Jane to stand on her stool. He doesn't want anyone else in the class chatting to her. Helen tells Jane that the rest of the class was not convinced that Jane was telling the truth and that they felt sorry for her and solidarity with her. During Jane's narrative of her encounters with Mr. Brocklehurst and her aunt's severe treatment, one instructor, Miss Temple, feels sorry for her. The school is informed that Jane is not a liar by Miss Temple. As a result of this, Jane becomes a better student at Lowood. Jane begins to like Lowood for a short while before Helen succumbs to consumption. Helen cheers Jane up by telling her that she isn't in agony when Jane sneaks into Miss Temple's room to see her. When Jane wakes up the next morning, she finds Helen dead in her bed. After Helen's death, an investigation into Lowood's treatment of her is launched, and a new set of overseers is appointed to take over the school's management, effectively removing Mr. Brocklehurst. Jane's life at Lowood improves dramatically, and for the following 6 years she excels in her academic pursuits. Jane decides to remain at Lowood as a teacher after she reaches the age of majority. Even after 2 years working as a teacher at Lowood, Jane decides to look for work as a governess. She is taken in by Thornfield, a palatial estate in the middle of a forest. A servant from her aunt's house comes to see Jane before she leaves town, and they discuss the events that have occurred at her childhood home since she left. That Georgiana has sought to elope in secret only to have her plot wrecked by Eliza notifying their mother, and that John has fallen into a hard life of debauchery are two things she learns from her investigation. She's also told that John Eyre, her father's brother, came looking for her 7 years earlier but fled to an island off the coast of Morocco in search of a fortune when he was told she wasn't there. A Mrs. Fairfax, the manor's housekeeper, greets Jane as she arrives to Thornfield in the second portion of the novel. Jane is given a tour of the estate by Mrs. Fairfax, a pleasant woman who explains to her that Mr. Rochester, the estate's owner, is frequently away on business and relies on her for day-to-day management of the property. Jane notices a strange giggle resonating through the house throughout the tour, and Mrs. Fairfax explains that it belongs to the eccentric seamstress who lives there, Grace Poole. Adele, a little French girl, is Mr. Rochester's ward, and her mother was a singer and dancer. Aside from the fact that she thinks Adele is a little spoilt, Jane really enjoys working with the girl. Jane is going around the grounds one day when a man on a horse passes her. A patch of ice causes the horse to collapse, and the rider is thrown to the ground. After helping the guy to his feet, Jane returns to Thornfield to finish her work. When she returns home, she learns that Mr. Rochester, the man she saved after he fell off his horse, has returned from his travels. Jane and Mr. Rochester don't get along right away. Because she's shy by nature and a servant, she's too aloof for his taste, and he's cold and nasty. Jane learns from Mrs. Fairfax that Mr. Rochester has a troubled past. Thornfield was only his after his elder brother, the Eyre, passed away, and their father had not been kind to him before to that. Jane soon notices that Mr. Rochester is chatting to her more frequently and asking for her presence, even if she doesn't know why. Their interactions are awkward for Jane. He then admits to Jane that he was having an affair with Adele's mother long before the child was born. His claim to be the girl's father is based on the fact that her mother had an affair with another man, and he believes that she does not look like him. When Adele's mother went on the run, he took her in and cared for her until she could find a new home. Afterwards, Jane can't sleep because she keeps thinking about Mr. Rochester and everything they talked about. She rushes out of her chamber when she hears a strange laugh and sees smoke pouring from under Mr. Rochester's door. She enters his room and discovers that his bed curtains have been set ablaze by a lighter. Jane instantly extinguishes the fire with water from his basin, thinking quickly. Mr. Rochester does not wait to leave the room when the fire breaks out because he wants to check out the top floor of the house. "I have figured it all out," he says Jane when he returns with the news in a cryptic voice. Reiterating what Mrs. Fairfax had said earlier, he tells Jane that the crazy seamstress who lives in the house is to blame for her laughing. Grace Poole doesn't appear to be remorseful the next morning, despite the fact that the fire from the night before spread throughout the house due to an errant candle. Aside from the mystery and Jane's affections for Rochester, she learns that he will be away for several days with Blanche Ingram, and she is heartbroken about it. When Jane realizes that nothing will ever happen between Rochester and her, she swears to stop thinking about him in a romantic way. Blanche Ingram is one of a group of wealthy, upper-class guests accompanying Rochester when he returns home soon. Rochester begs Jane to join the group, but she refuses because she feels uncomfortable in the presence of her superiors. The time passes, and Jane is about to go when Rochester intervenes. As soon as she makes it clear that she wants to go, he forces her to spend some time with his group every evening until they depart. He was on the verge of uttering a sweet nothing to her as he said his goodnights before biting his lip. During the course of the visitor's stay, Rochester is visited by a guy named Mr. Mason. Jane doesn't like him, but she has a sneaking suspicion that he has some sort of connection to Rochester. Jane is awakened by a scream for aid that night. In the hall, Rochester is reassuring his visitors that a servant had just had a nightmare, prompting her to dash out of the room. In a private matter, Rochester seeks Jane's help. His first stop is a room on the third floor where he finds Mr. Mason, who has been stabbed in the arm. There are no more words said between the two characters after Rochester tells Jane to take care of her wound. Mr. Mason's agony will be alleviated soon enough if Jane follows his instructions. A letter informs Jane that her cousin John has committed suicide and her aunt has had a stroke and is near death before she can discover what happened to Mr. Mason. Jane returns to her aunt's residence in an attempt to mend fences with her ailing relative. In spite of this, the lady still resents and rejects her. John Eyre wishes to adopt Jane and give her his money in the case that he dies, and Jane receives a letter from Mrs. Reed before she dies. Out of spite, Mrs. Reed refused to deliver Jane's letter to her at Lowood. After her aunt's death, Jane arrives to Thornfield and discovers that Rochester and his guests have left. Jane interprets Rochester's trip to London to acquire a carriage as a sure sign that he and Blanche will soon be married. The carriage is plenty for Mrs. Rochester when Jane visits Rochester again, and he inquires about it. During their walk around the gardens, Rochester reveals to Jane his decision to marry Blanche. When Jane confesses her love for Rochester, he unexpectedly asks her to marry him. It was Jane who was his true love, and he simply declared he was going to marry Blanche as a ruse to get her to admit her feelings for him. Jane joyfully accepts the proposal and the two have a passionate kiss. It's hard to miss Mrs. Fairfax's amazement. Jane feels like she's in a fairy tale as she plans her wedding, believing that everything is too lovely to be true. She is apprehensive about the notion. So as not to jeopardize her uncle's plans, she sends him a letter notifying him of her current location. In her mind, she believes that if she were to inherit her uncle's estate, she would feel more at ease with Rochester and less anxious about the wedding. An unidentified woman is found lurking around Jane's bedroom the night before her wedding. She rips the veil from Jane's head. The next day, when she tells Rochester, he assures her that it was Gray's pool. On the day of the wedding, a stranger interrupts the ceremony and tries to stop it from going through. He introduces himself as Mr. Briggs, a London solicitor, and explains that Rochester is already married to Bertha Mason, the sister of Mr. Mason. In order to back up the story, Mr. Mason himself is on hand. Rochester, despite his fury, concedes that the narrative is real. When they return to Thornfield, he yanks them all the way to the top of the house. In the attic, Jane discovers Bertha Mason, who is being cared for by Gray's pool. Rochester is about to be strangled by Bertha, who has gone insane. Jane leaves the room in a hurry and retreats to her room to grieve. As soon as the next morning, Rochester tells Jane that he does not consider himself married because he believes that Jane's family has a history of mental illness. It was determined to keep Bertha safe in the attic so that she could be taken care of. Though moved by his story, Jane is compelled to leave Thornfield to deal with his pain and humiliation on her own. Jane quickly runs out of money once she leaves and is forced to live on the streets. She spots a light in the distance while wandering the moors and follows it to discover a house. Diana, Mary, and John, Diana and Mary's brother, all share a home. Jane gets a position at a local charity school thanks to John's efforts. John is a devout Christian who aspires to serve as a missionary in another country. He develops a fondness for Jane and sets out to learn about her past on his own. When Jane arrived at the sisters' residence, she had given them a fictitious identity. In response to a letter from Mr. Briggs, John informs her that finding Jane Eyre is critical. Upon the death of her aunt's uncle, John Eyre, Jane has been left a sizable inheritance. When Jane confronts Mr. Briggs about why he's contacting the sisters and John, he reveals that her uncle was also his, something he hadn't realized previously. Jane is delighted to have found a loving family and resolves to distribute her riches evenly among herself and her 3 children. Soon after, John asks Jane if she would want to join him in India as a missionary and his wife. She'll go on a mission trip with him, but she won't get married to him because she doesn't care about him at all. John is enraged by this and tries to coerce Jane into marrying him over the next few days. Jane hears what she believes to be Mr. Rochester's voice calling her one night during supper. She has a sneaking suspicion that something has happened to him, so she makes haste to return to Thornfield as soon as she possibly can. A year after she departed, Jane returns not only with money but also a family of her own to greet her upon her return. A fire had completely obliterated Thornfield by the time Jane returns. A few months earlier, Bertha had finally managed to start a fire in the house. However, Rochester was unable to save his wife, who took her own life before he could reach her, when she threw herself from the roof. In addition to being severely burned, Rochester suffered severe burns to both his eyes and a hand as a result of the fire. When Jane learns that he now lives with 2 old servants in a cottage in the woods, she is shocked. Jane arrives at Rochester's new residence, but he initially doubts her identity due to his blindness. He thinks she's a spirit, and he believes she's speaking to him. Jane vows Rochester that she would never leave him again as she embraces him in her arms. Once again, she agrees to be his wife when he makes the proposal. Jane takes Adele to a prestigious school after their nuptials are private. After a year under Jane's care, Rochester begins to regain some of his sight. Couples that have children together and live together as equals have a long life ahead of them. Jane Eyre, as a young girl orphaned, Jane is an introverted woman who longs for love but doubts she will ever experience it. Her sincerity is what Jane regards as her most valuable quality throughout the story. Jane is quite down to earth and first dismisses Rochester's feelings for her. As she grows closer to him, she realizes how foolish she is for falling in love with him in the first place. In the second half of the novel, he affirms that he is in love with her as well, and her character begins to open up a bit. As a result, when Rochester and his rational first wife break her heart, it hits the reader with a vengeance. Jane, who appears to consider herself as a martyr, accepts all of her punishments without complaint throughout the novel. Her story concludes with a joyful ending. She gets to live with the man she loves and help take care of him. Mr. Rochester, he is first thought to be a harsh, cold man but soon warms up to Jane and, because of her schooling, begins to see her as somewhat of an equal to his wit. Rochester spends a lot of time regretting his past actions and trying to hide his flaws from others. Despite this, he appears to truly care for his staff, particularly for tiny Adele and of course, her mother, Jane. There are other women in the novel who find Rochester attractive not because of his looks but because of his manners and fortune. Unlike Jane, Rochester seemed to have little difficulty falling in love with Jane. He regards her as both intellectually and morally superior to himself. Even after years of violence and threats to his life, he cannot bring himself to put his wife in a mental facility. For years, Rochester had been a womanizer and a pleasure seeker, and he now believes that any tiny mishaps in his life are punishment for his past transgressions. Ending with Rochester in poor health and few servants, he tries to hide from society and take his injuries as a form of retribution for the evil he has done. However, when Jane returns, he changes his mind and is able to lead a happy life with her, even regaining some of his sight. Mrs. Fairfax, she is the housekeeper at Thornfield Manor. Every day, she is in charge of the housekeeping staff, including the butlers, cooks, and maids. Because to Mrs. Fairfax, Mr. Rochester is able to tell Jane that the strange laughing she hears in the home comes from a sewing machine belonging to an eccentric seamstress named Grace Poole. Whether Mrs. Fairfax is aware that Rochester's wife Bertha is living in the attic is never revealed in the novel. She appears surprised to witness Jane and Rochester kissing in the garden and to learn of their planned marriage. She may, however, be surprised by the match because she thinks it is inappropriate. Adele Varence, Jane tutors Adele at Thornfield, a sweet but spoilt girl. Adele considers Jane to be a second mother to her and enjoys spending time with her. Towards the book's conclusion, Jane mentions Adele attending a nice school after learning that she disliked her first choice. According to what we've heard, when she grows up, she'll be a lovely and friendly woman. John Rivers, John is Jane's cousin, a preacher and a missionary. A religious man who is often enraged and rarely disagreed with, he is prone to conflict. The moment Jane rejects his proposal, he becomes irate and attempts to exert control and pressure on her. Rochester's nemesis in the play is John. Although John is typically referred to as cool, Rochester is often regarded as fiery, and the two are often contrasted. As a good woman, Jane sees marriage to John as a type of martyrdom and a chance to devote herself for the missionary work he plans to conduct. For the sake of Rochester, she chooses love above duty and returns there. She was told to stay with him in Morton and avoid returning to Thornfield at the end of John's last appearance. Mrs. Reed, cruel Jane's aunt who treated her badly for the first years of her life. Jane is a victim of Mrs. Reed's resentment of her late husband, Mr. Reed's love for the girl. Even as she lies dying, she refuses to make amends with Jane. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.